Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred. And in this video, I want to share with you an exercise that's really helpful when you want to unblend yourself or you want to help your client unblend from a really big protector that maybe overwhelms many other parts in your system. So this might be an inner critic, a raging part, that just has really big energy. So I'm actually going to share my screen and show it to you for a moment. Let's see. Okay. So this is called the room exercise. And this is one of the most common unblending exercises used in IFS that can be really helpful. Again, sometimes it'll be helpful, sometimes it won't. It's just an experiment to see. It is used with scary or intense parts that feel overwhelming to a client system. Like I said, things like big inner critics or raging parts that other parts feel afraid of or really frustrated by. So you might say something like, let's put him in a room that's comfortable for him and you can be outside for now. Any part who doesn't want to watch you talking with this monster part, often they appear like monsters, can go to a waiting room. Sometimes you can put them in a room with a one-way mirror or just a window that you're looking through, but people's systems often feel much better about just at least beginning to observe that part and what it's doing and what it's saying if their system feels a little bit of clear boundary and separation, so they're not afraid of that part taking over and harming other parts. And like this says, the really fearful parts can go ahead and go to another waiting room. And then once that happens, you can let the part know that you just want to know more about them. And as you or your client is able to feel less judgmental and less fearful and more curious and open toward this part, you'll begin to understand some of their desperate energy and why they do what they do and what their fears are and what happened. So that'll begin to reveal itself. And then that'll lead more into clarity and compassion and confidence and connection with that part. So a law of inner physics to understand here is that whatever you do not fear in the inner system cannot harm you. So you can tell your parts or your client's parts this law of inner physics. And this is why it's important to have the fearful parts go to another space, because then it makes room for your naturally courageous, confident self to emerge. And the self really understands that whatever it's not afraid of cannot hurt it. Okay. So I want to read this example from none other than Martha Sweezy's book, Internal Family Systems Therapy for Shame and Guilt. There it is. So this is an example of Martha using this technique with a client. So she says, this technique, the room, is a great option when an exile or a protector, like we said, threatens emotional overwhelm, or a scary protector intimidates other parts. So she says, I use this with Eliot, a 29-year-old cisgender, single, gay, Somali American man. Eliot's family fled the civil war in Somalia and came to the US when he was 5 years old. He came to therapy because of nightmares, and he discovered a kaiju, which you'll find out what that is in a moment. So Eliot's manager begins the session and says, do you know the kaiju? And Martha shakes her head, and he says, it means strange beast in Japanese. It's like a version of Godzilla. This part is a kaiju, and everyone inside is scared of him. So again, these parts often show up visually as some form of a monster, right? Like I have parts that appear like a demon or a demogorgon or a Bigfoot, or, you know, they appear as these kind of big, intimidating things. So Martha says, okay, let's put him in a room that's safe and comfortable for him. And you can be outside for now. And any part who doesn't want to watch you talking with the kaiju can go to a waiting room. Exactly what I was saying. And Eliot's manager says, he hates being in the room. He's running around and smashing the walls. This is very common because these big parts have a lot of energy and they do not want to be contained, usually because they believe that they must do their job. And if you've contained them, they're not going to be able to do their job, and they're very upset about it. Martha says, ask him to take a break and tell you about himself. And Eliot says, he says, what do I want to know? The therapist says, well, what would you like to know about the kaiju, Eliot? Eliot says, why are you trying to scare me? So Eliot's got some curiosity here, is asking out of genuine curiosity. So Martha continues with this and says, what does he say? Eliot says he wants a snack. And Martha just goes with this, right? She says, well, what do kaijus eat? And Eliot said, people. So Martha says, ask this kaiju if he belongs to you. Is he one of your parts? So this is interesting. I think Martha is trying to see here if this is a UB, an unattached burden. Like, is this really a part of you? Or is this something that is separate from you that's just kind of terrorizing your system? And so she says, ask if he belongs to you. And Eliot's response is half and half. So Martha asks, you know, some of his energy comes from outside of you, and Eliot nods. And she says, are any of your other parts attached to the energy from the outside? Eliot shakes his head no. And she says, is he attached to it, the kaiju? And Eliot nods. So what can happen essentially is an unattached burden or a legacy burden of some kind can be attached, obviously, to a part. So she's just getting clarification about this. So basically, the kaiju is a part of Eliot, but is holding on half of its energy as something other. So Martha asks, what would happen to him if you let go of this half that's not him? And Eliot says he won't. And the therapist says, we're not going to make him do it, but we just want to know if he did, what would happen? Eliot says, I would be weak and vulnerable. So Martha says, what if you could help your vulnerable parts so he didn't have to worry about them? Eliot says, that would be great, but how am I going to do that? And Martha again offers this hope. If the kaiju is willing, I will show you, right? So again, the kaiju is protecting more vulnerable parts and feels like if I'm not blended with this really strong, aggressive energy, these parts will be left unprotected and will be vulnerable. So again, Martha says, but what if we could help the vulnerable parts? Would you still have to be this intimidating? Would you still have to keep this energy that's not yours, this aggressive energy? Sometimes these aggressive burdens can come from other people, often our own perpetrators. People have transgressed against us. We take on their energy, many times because they were the most powerful one in the room when we were being victimized. And so parts of us take on that energy to say, I'm going to take on the perpetrator's energy to protect so that this never happens to me again. So really the hope is of the client's self, Eliot's self, being able to go to those parts that experienced trauma, to be with them so that the kaiju can release that terrorizing energy. And the last thing Martha says is, in this example, Eliot finds and begins to befriend a buffed up firefighter part in the form of a kaiju. Eliot was a big fan of Japanese manga. To speed this effort along, we put the kaiju in a room so he could talk to it, and we sequestered the parts who were scared in a waiting room. Again, so just an example of using that waiting room technique so that you can begin to build a relationship. Just one side note on this, it really is interesting because what happens on the inside is parallel to what happens on the outside, right? When another person is blended with a really big protector that is intimidating, threatening, harming us, it's really important that we create enough space so that our system feels safe enough to interact with that person. So that might mean saying, I will only meet with you with other people around, or I will only talk to you on the phone, or I will only communicate via email. Creating whatever distance we need to create so that we can stay courageous and curious and confident in regard to them. But if we're in that space where they are really overwhelming our vulnerable parts, it's very, very hard for us to stay in self around them. So I love the definition of a healthy boundary as it's the distance between you and I at which I can value both you and I simultaneously, right? So this inner arrangement of putting this really big, intimidating part in a room, creating a bit of a barrier, a bit of a distance, right? So that our system can feel safe enough interacting with the part, and then eventually disarm them by getting curious and understanding what's underneath what they're doing. We often can't do that with parts inside or people in their parts on the outside unless our system feels safe enough in regards to them, which usually means creating some kind of boundary or distance. And there's no problem with that. That's really often the way forward. So I hope you appreciated this example. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them below.